Erev Tov and welcome everyone. Before we get into tonight's topic, which I've actually given it 3 or 4 different titles, navigating the house of tomorrow, today, Shabbat and electricity, etc., like that, there's a principle. It will come up again in these sources that we actually learned for those who are on the class about Eruv. But I'll just give the very simplified version, which I also gave in the class on Eruv, which is when the Torah says do not do work on Shabbat, it does not define that. It uses a Hebrew word melacha, which you could easily just translate as work, but there's a specific kind of work. There's actually a phrase in the Torah, melechet machshevet, thoughtful work. And what the rabbis do is they define the kind of work forbidden on Shabbat as any work which was part of building and the functioning of specifically the Mishkan, the tabernacle, but then later the Beit HaMikdash. So everything from trapping animals that would use for sacrifices or the skins to cover it around to cooking to make the dyes, 39 different categories. And if something is not included in those categories, it's permitted on Shabbat. But it's not just anything. Obviously, when you build the Mishkan, you need to use your hands to lift things. You need to be able to walk. So it's unique category, things that are unique to the Beit HaMikdash, not just general things. So for example, walking on Shabbat is not specific to the Mishkan. It's just a general thing people do. It's fine. Stacking chairs, setting a table, all of these things require some sort of effort, but they're not unique to the functioning of the Mishkan. And the Torah itself tells us what's unique to it. And the reason I'm emphasizing these mundane activities is they will come up again. Opening a door, obviously a door, opening it, locking it, like there's, things involved in that. But that's, again, it's a common, not special activity, so it's permitted on Shabbat. But the question is, what if you have something, an activity that seems like it shouldn't be, it seems weird to do it on Shabbat, but there's no specific category for it to fit into. One of a class I'm not doing tonight, but an interesting one of my friends said is, what about someone with supernatural or superpowers who can fly or move through walls or shoot lasers? It sounds ridiculous, but a lot of those activities might seem inappropriate on Shabbat, yet they are functions of that person. And our tradition does deal with magic. So tonight, what we're talking about specifically is electricity, and more specifically about electricity that you can't get away from. The specific example we'll look at, which is more relevant today to places like hotels, but it will be relevant to all houses going forward for the next, hundreds of years, are automatic sensors. Meaning you walk into a room, and you may or may not be aware of some of this technology. There's a company called Nest. And if you walk into the house, there's a sensor that detects that you're home and it raises or lowers the temperature. It does that so that it's not wasting electricity. Or walking through an automatic door so you can get into anywhere, your apartment building, or at a hotel where the only way to get into your room is a key card. Automatic lights going, again, a lot of hotel rooms to save energy and to make it easier, have all of these automatic sensors. But the issue is that for the rabbis, activating electronic devices on Shabbat is not permitted. Now, I sort of made a big jump there and didn't fill it in, which is, how was electricity included in one of the 39 categories? Because they didn't have electricity when they built the Mishkan. And the answer is a little beyond the scope of this class. I've actually given a class using this first source Rabbi Eliezer Melamed, who discussed why electricity is forbidden on Shabbat. And one of the issues is the way that electricity was used in the beginning for light bulbs, for microwaves, things like that, it functioned in the same way that fire would. So a lot of the earliest rabbis said, look, it's not actually fire, which is forbidden to use on Shabbat, but it's enough like it that we are uncomfortable with it. But the problem is, again, it's not fire. So the rabbis bent over backwards to come up with reasons why it's forbidden. For example, building. You can't build the Mishkan. You can't build a house on Shabbat. So when you flick a light switch, what are you doing? You are closing a circuit. Physically, you are literally attaching, making two things come into contact with each other by physically moving the switch. That is completing the circuit, that is building. Again, it might sound a little absurd to our minds, but the rabbis were so opposed to what electricity and using electricity could do to Shabbat, because fine, I can't light a candle in my house. I can't cook on a gas oven stove, but I could use my electric stove. I could turn off the light switches. I could use my phone on Shabbat. All of those things aren't strictly forbidden. They're not one of the 39 categories. So the debate of the rabbis came by, well, we don't like it. We're going to forbid it. The question is it forbidden as one of the categories of the Torah? Or are we just creating a new custom because it'll ruin Shabbat? And that question about all of these automatic sensors and what they'll do to the Shabbat experience, we'll re-explore at the end. But now that you have a very general background, which is anything related to the Mishkan is forbidden on Shabbat, electricity is not related to the Mishkan, but the rabbis were deeply uncomfortable with it and came up with half a dozen reasons why it would be problematic. And the agreement was, look, we're going to forbid the activation of electronic devices, not because of the Mishkan, but because it'll ruin Shabbat. There are some rabbis, might be mentioned here, who feel like it really is with sparks and fire, it's forbidden. But the consensus really is the rabbis did not want us to activate electronic devices because of what I do to Shabbat. And that's how halacha develops. Even if the reasoning behind it may not make sense anymore, that is the standard halacha. So with that in mind, that everyone agrees within this system of halacha that one cannot activate electronic devices, turn on a light switch, touch a button, a voice activated. I'm not going to do it right now because I do actually have one of those devices, and if I accidentally do it, I might turn on music or something. Question is, would those things be permitted, being that electricity is not forbidden by the Torah, but it is forbidden by the rabbis because of their utter discomfort with it. So Tamar, I'm going to unmute you. So this first source is excellent. This is, again, a rabbi I've used many times, Rabbi Eliezer Melamed, and he wrote this series that not only gave the practical halacha, both for Ashkenazim, but he also mentioned Sephardic ones, but he explains both the reasoning behind it, how the rabbis came to this, and he tries to give inspiration. Why does it matter? Why should we care about it? So even though not everyone will agree with him, and I don't agree with everything he's ever said, he gives brilliant and clear summations of the topic. And this English translation is the official one. So while it may not match word for word with the Hebrew, it's a very good one. So Tamar, please, and he goes right into it. This is the section on automatic doors, things with sensors, and we'll use that as the basis to rule for everything else about the smart homes of the future, spaceships, what have you. So Tamar, please.
One may not approach a door that automatically opens when it senses someone near it. One who does so is viewed as directly triggering the electricity that opens the door. It is immaterial whether the system works through floor sensors, an electric eye, a motion detector, or
the like.
One who finds
Oh, just pause. Sorry for 1 second, Tamar. A relevant thing that we won't delve into too much is this is talking about somebody who, they know there's a sensor there or they want to open the door. If somebody's walking down a street and they accidentally activate, an automatic light, that's a different case. And there's some debates because there's one thing that says, if I walk away from the light only turns on when there's someone, directly into it. But if I leave the field of view, what's the light going to do? It's going to turn off. And I've caused it to turn off. So there's some who say that if there's no other light source there, you're stuck. But everyone agrees that, look, if it's 5 minutes before the end of Shabbos and you accidentally turn on a floodlight in front of your grandparents' house and you can hang outside for 5 minutes, better to not do that now that you know that your leaving will deactivate the sensor. But if it's before Shabbat lunch, your family's waiting you're late from shul, and it will cause a lot of issues, everyone agrees because it was accidental, you didn't want it to happen, and it's electricity, which is only rabbinically forbidden. We'll come back to that. Go into the house. That's not really what we're talking about here. We're talking about, can you intentionally activate these sensors? So Tamar, thank you. Please continue. One who finds
himself in the hotel or hospital with automatic doors must find an alternative way to enter that does not involve using electricity. If a non-Jew approaches the door in order to enter, a Jew may follow him in doctors.
Follow him in, and then period, and then continue.
Doctors and nurses may enter the hospital through an automatic door as their work entails saving lives. Others may then follow them through the door.
Pause there for a moment. So years ago, I was staying at my friend's in New York over Shabbos, and what I didn't realize, or maybe I didn't even think about it, was that she had an automatic door, and it was the only way I knew to get in the building. If it was my building, maybe I could have figured out a back door. So what I did is people came in and out all the time. I waited for somebody who I assumed was non-Jewish walking in, and I walked in right behind them. Now, there are some very strict opinions that say once you've walked in after them, you're also causing the sensor to keep the door open even longer. Generally, people aren't that strict, but this is the mainstream opinion, whereby one cannot walk through the door unless they follow a non-Jew who can do whatever they want. They don't have to keep the laws of Shabbat, or a doctor or nurse who, for their job, for medical reasons, saving life, of course they can do it. So ideally, what you do is just find another way into the building. Find a back door where you use a physical lock and key where you don't have to activate sensors. And obviously, we're not done with this conversation, but you can see this: the more buildings are becoming automated, the more challenges this is going to pose. So go ahead, Tamar, please. Some say.
Just a moment. Some
Sure.
say that if one unintentionally came too close to an automatic door, thus causing it to open, he must remain in place, because moving away will cause the door to close. They maintain that he should wait until a non-Jew arrives and ask the non-Jew to stand near him, at which point he can leave. Afterwards, when the non-Jew leaves as well, the non-Jew will be the one who causes the door to close. However, if remaining in place causes the Jew anguish, he may simply leave, as he is just walking normally and does not care if the door opens or closes. This act of leaving is a psik risha, de lo nifha.
Lo nichale, like
Lo
no, it's not.
nichale. Okay. Brought about via grammar, which is not forbidden.
So this
Even
is
if they...
Oh, sorry, just 1 second, Tamar. This is a very, very important line because it will become the basis for some more lenient opinions later. So if somebody, let's say one of the 39 categories is kindling a fire. So if I just say, I'm going to kindle a fire because I want to cook, or I want to have a bonfire, and I take a match and I light that match and I start the fire, I have broken Shabbos in the most explicit way absolutely possible. And not only have I broken Shabbat, but I've broken a Torah level commandment. So were the Beit HaMikdash and the Sanhedrin around, I would be in big trouble if I was warned before. Again, it's a little more complicated, but it is bad to explicitly break Shabbat, a Torah commandment. Now, what if I sneezed and my shoulder accident? I was in a kitchen, my shoulder hit a button that turns on an ignition for some automatic barbecue and it starts a fire. Now, I've broken a Torah commandment, but it was accidental. So it's really not my fault, and it's not the end of the world. So the worst thing is a Torah level commandment on purpose. And then a level below that is accidentally breaking a Torah commandment. Let's say, I know this sounds absurd, but they talk about this in the Mishnah. One of the forbidden Torah level, like forbidden by God's Torah, or the understanding of the rabbis, is to trap an animal like a deer. Well, what if I come home, I see the front door open, and there happens to be a deer inside? I'm like, oh no, the front door's open, the cat can get out, I close the door. I have broken a Torah level commandment, but it's totally accidental. So that's the level down. But now you keep going down the ladder of things where you're not allowed to do it, but eventually you get to the point where it might even be permitted. So now we're at the level of something which is rabbinically forbidden. And we'll just use our example, electricity. It is not forbidden by God's Torah. It's the rabbi's understanding of electricity that they did not want it to be used on Shabbat. So it's forbidden by the rabbi. So the one who is observant of the laws of Shabbat, the mainstream, would not activate electronic devices. Even a Tesla car, they wouldn't turn on purpose. But what if one accidentally activates an electric device? What's the easiest thing? My shoulder hit a light switch. Again, I can't intentionally turn on a light switch, but the thing that I've done wrong is so low, me accidentally turning on a light switch using electricity, which is rabbinically forbidden, that there's really no punishment. I don't need to feel guilty. I can hit my chest on Yom Kippur, but I've really done nothing wrong. So what they talk about, this line here, there's a couple different phrases in here. Psik resha. The example of a psik resha is literally like cutting off the head. And what the rabbis say is, if you cut off a chicken's head, of course the chicken is going to die. So too, if I step on a sensor by an automatic door, the door is going to open. If I open my refrigerator and I haven't deactivated the light is going to turn on. It's going to happen no matter what. However, in the case of a refrigerator, I want the food inside, but on Shabbat, I don't want the light to go on. It actually pains me. It's bad for me. I don't want the light to go on. So you would say in Aramaic or Hebrew, de lo nichale, it's not good for him, i.e., it's an inevitable act, but I don't really want it to happen. Now, if I'm walking on a sensor door, like with an automatic door, A, it's definitely going to open if I move in front of the sensor, and B, I want it to open so I can get inside. But if I accidentally do it, like I'm just walking with friends by an apartment in Manhattan, the door opens. Of course, it's going to open if you hit the sensor. It was accidental. I didn't want it to open. And the last one is this really important phrase, grama, which means cause. So if anyone played that board game when they were young, Mousetrap, or seen a Rube Goldberg machine, it's where you start, you drop a marble and it goes down a slide and knocks another marble and et cetera. And it goes through 50 different steps. Now, the question is, after the 58th step, did you really cause that to happen? Strictly speaking, yes. If you hadn't dropped the first marble, this machine wouldn't have activated. But are you the direct one that did the 58th step, that lit the match, that turned on the device? Did you actually do it with your body? And the answer is no, it was indirect. So in this case, with a sensor, I didn't go up to the door and open it. I accidentally activated a sensor, which sent a signal, which caused the door to open. The reason it's so important to emphasize this is because while here, we're taking generally the strict view where we can't activate sensors, depending on how you look at it, me activating a sensor, it's rabbinically prohibited, which doesn't mean we can do it, but it's a lower prohibition because it's electricity. And I'm not directly opening the door like a light switch. Nobody, at the end of this article, nobody says a light switch is okay. But maybe if it's really indirect, I touch a plate that sends a signal here, that sends a signal here, it's so indirect that if there's no other way to get in the building, then maybe it's even permitted. But right now, it's not okay. So again, just to distinguish, a light switch, you are not allowed to turn on and off, even though electricity is rabbinically forbidden, you're directly causing it. Whereas the sensor, the mainstream ruling is you can't activate it indirectly, but maybe there's some room. So let's go to the end of this piece now that we have that whole thing in there. Yeah, please, Tamar.
Even if the person who mistakenly caused the automatic door to open did in fact want to enter, in a time of need, he may still enter, since the melacha was unintentional. In contrast, if he intended for the door to open but forgot and only later remembered that it is forbidden, he should not enter, because one may not benefit from the melacha that was unknowingly performed on Shabbat.
So we're not going to focus so much on that last one, but what was right before it, and this is so important because he says one can't go up to an automatic door. Again, that's the ruling here in the Penine Halacha, and it's generally the accepted ruling. You're going to find the vast majority of books on Shabbat, you Google it, whatever, most rabbis will say that's the ruling. If there's a sensor door, unless it's a life or death issue, or medical, like a doctor, you have to wait for a non-Jew. But what if you're waiting outside and again, you sneeze or something like that, or you move your foot slightly and it opens, and you knew it's forbidden, you were being very careful to not do it, but you accidentally opened it, you could potentially go in. Why? Because there's a lot of room for leniency, because we're dealing with something that's forbidden by the rabbis, which again, doesn't mean we could just do it, but it's a lower level of prohibition. So there's a lot more flexibility and room for leniency. It's also indirect, and certainly you did it unintentionally. So in the realm of electricity, there is a lot of flexibility. So that's the kind of mainstream basis of it about electronic doors. And he's going to build on that a little bit in this next source, talking a little bit more about lights and sensors, but you'll see it's the same general principle. So before I go on to the second source, any questions up until now?
I'll ask a question.
Yeah, Tamar, bevakasha.
You mentioned the refrigerator light, but even by opening the door of the refrigerator, you activate it. Yet it is acceptable to do.
And by the way, it's a very similar ruling to using a drinking fountain. If I drink a drinking fountain, which maybe, if I push the button, maybe that's manual. If I leave it on long enough, it's going to activate the machine to turn on, to cool the water, but it's totally permitted in every circle. He mentions it, I don't know if I cut it out here, but the reason that is permitted goes back to these principles. So there's a couple really important things here. So let's look at these three things: psik, resha, de lo nichale, and grama. So psik resha means no matter what, it's going to be activated. Now, a refrigerator is not, it is constantly running, but when you open the door, it doesn't automatically activate the engines or whatever, the motor, to cool it down unless you leave it open for a certain amount of time. Now, unless you have a special sensor that says in 3 seconds the motor will activate, there's no way for you to know that it's definitely going to turn on. Same thing with a drinking fountain. If you've ever taken a long drip at a drinking fountain, which I really want to do right now, if you drink long enough, you'll hear the motor kick in because that's, recooling the water. But if you take a quick sip, nothing's really going to happen. So this first thing about psik resha, about it's absolutely going to happen, is not always the case with refrigerators. So again, by the way, we're talking electricity. So we're in a realm where we can be lenient. So there's no psik resha. So that already knocks it down. It's not definitely going to happen. Delo nichale. Do I want it or not want it to happen? That's an interesting one. I mean, I don't want the motor to turn on. I want my food to be cold. But what I really want to do is be able to get my stuff out of the fridge fast enough that I don't activate the motor. So if it just so happens that someone before me opened the fridge and someone before them opened it, and it does turn on, I didn't want that. I want it to be in and out so quick that the regular cold of the fridge, the regular running of it would be enough. So again, it's the lo nichale, so it knocks it down another peg. And when I open the refrigerator or turn on a drinking fountain, what do they call it here? A bubbler. Everyone's like, what's a drinking fountain? If I turn on a bubbler, there's not a switch on the side where I push it to activate the motor to cool it down. So it's indirect. My opening of the fridge is not certain to do it. I don't really want it to do it. And I'm not directly doing it. That knocks it down so unbelievably far. It is so far away from the forbidden activity of intentionally activating electricity. And again, you may not even do it. You still don't want it to happen. And because it's a rabbinic prohibition, not only is it not forbidden, it's straight up permitted. But the reason that sensors, like a light sensor, a door sensor, is not the same as a refrigerator is it is psik resha, that you cut off the chicken's head, it will die. It definitely will open. Nichale, I do want it to open. So the only thing we have to play with, it's rabbinic and it's indirect. That was a really great question, Tamar. So again, refrigerators and drinking fountains and the like are permitted because it's not 100% you'll activate it. You don't really want the motor to turn on, and you're not directly doing it, and it's on electricity, which is rabbinic, so there's room for leniency there. If we were talking about all this for a Torah level prohibition, things would be a little bit different. So great point. Excellent. Gloria, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. So the second one, again, it builds on it, but Tamar's question was great because it allowed us to look at these principles in the real world and see how it can apply to one thing. It doesn't seem to apply in our case. So he talks about lights and sensors in the next section. So please, Gloria.
One may not enter a room where doing so automatically turns on the lights or air conditioning. While one might claim that he did not intend to turn on the lights or the air conditioning by entering the room, the fact is that everyone knows how the system works in such places. This problem is common in hotel rooms and bathrooms. One who stays in such a hotel must make sure that the system is switched off before Shabbat. If he did not take care of this in advance and is outside his room when Shabbat begins, he may not ask a non-Jew.
He may ask a non-Jew.
Oh, he may ask a non-Jew to open the door for him. He should further ask the non-Jew to stay for a bit so that the non-Jew will benefit from the lights or air conditioning, since he is then viewed as having turned them on for his own sake, and the Jew may then benefit from them. What if the hotel, I lost it.
I just moved it. It should be at the very top of the PDF now.
What if the hotel guest is inside such a room when Shabbat begins, and he knows that if he leaves, it will cause the lights or air conditioning to shut off? If he can easily stay inside until after Shabbat, or if a non-Jew is due to come shortly to disable the system, it is preferable to wait inside.
Wait, yeah. Mm-hmm.
However, if doing so causes him anguish, he may leave the room or bathroom because the purpose of this system is to save the hotel money by conserving electricity.
Pause there for a moment, Gloria. It's again, let's apply our principles here. So it's electricity, which is rabbinic, which again, you can't just willy-nilly use, but this is a case where it's indirect. So it is psi creation. It's definitely going to happen. If you leave the room, you know it'll go off, but you don't want it to go off. You want lights that will just stay on. So it's lo nichale. It's not nice or good for the person. And it's indirect. Again, this person is not turning the light on or off when they leave the room. So you have, they have the 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon, that game where you try and connect actors to the actor Kevin Bacon. It's exactly what's happening here. It's the 2, 3, 4, 5 degrees of a forbidden prohibition. Now, there's something important here. He doesn't just say, once you've lowered down the prohibition because it's indirect, et cetera, like that, there still needs to be a reason to do it. So I'm not just going to run around activating all these sensors and stuff like that. He says it's in a case of anguish, meaning there's a need. So if someone can stay in a place and it's no big deal, and again, for how many people is that no big deal to be stuck in the hotel all of Shabbos, then fine, do it that way. But that's one of the key things here. Once you've made it not a prohibition, knocked it down so many pegs, there still needs to be some reason to do it. For example, I can hint, not ask, I can hint to a non-Jew that it's really hot in the house and they'll understand to turn on the air conditioner. But I can only do that because it's miserably hot. I can't just hint to a non-Jew to break Shabbat on my behalf for no reason whatsoever. So that's really key here. And one of the things that's important to this class is that's all we're talking about. We're talking about the house of tomorrow, where my ability to function, live, go to hotels, go to conferences. I can't be part of the modernizing world unless I figure a way around these things. So he says, ideally, you ask a non-Jew, you have them turned off, et cetera, like that. But more and more, that's not the world we're living in. I haven't been in a hotel in quite some time, but I don't know of many hotels that have a manual key. Every hotel door I've seen has only that electronic key. I'm sure there are exceptions. Sarah and I usually stay in Airbnbs, so we don't really have to deal with this stuff, but it's a problem that cannot be ignored. So please, Gloria, continue.
The hotel guest does not care about that. So it is a case of seek Resha Dilo Nihale.
Nichale, it's going to happen when you leave the room, but you don't want it to happen. Oh, and he continues.
Regarding a rabbinic prohibition, since all agree that the prohibition of turning off the lights or air conditioning is rabbinic. When necessary, in such a case, one may be lenient. However, as we saw earlier, once the guest has left his room, he will be able to return to it because doing so will turn on the lights and air conditioning. The only way for him to re-enter would be the help of a non-Jew. Therefore, the proper course of action in this case is to ask a non-Jew to disable the system. Then the guest will be able to enter and exit the room as needed. Excellent.
Now that we've seen, again, this is kind of the mainstream. You're going to find this in most books you're going to buy. And this is not like the super ultra Orthodox. This is, in modern Orthodox, this is generally the mainstream, although as we'll see in a moment, there's some voices pushing back. And I'm glad the conversation is going on. But one of the things here is, if you have a hotel where there's 20 rooms, 15 of them are electronic and 5 are not, then use the non-electronic ones if it's easy enough to do it. But that's not the world we're talking about. We're talking about a world where every new house, again, that's not the reality, but let's say we're talking about a world where every new house is built with automatic sensors for lights, for air conditioning, which, by the way, is awesome. It would be great for us all to have that. And a lot of those systems, you can often make a setting so it doesn't activate by the sensors. But let's say that's the standard. It's good for the environment. It's good for our wallets, but it's challenging on Shabbat. So right now, in a world where there's usually a way to get around it, our house doesn't have a Nest. We even considered putting one in, and we decided against it. But a lot of houses has it. The question is, if you don't have to do it, so fine. So ask a non-Jew or find some way to get around it. But what happens when it's totally ubiquitous? It's just everywhere. You cannot function in this world without dealing with sensors. And again, I use the example of one of my rabbis in Israel who always, I don't know if he was joking, but he said one day he wanted to write a book about Star Trek and Shabbat. And on that ship, you cannot do anything. There's a computer system that constantly is monitoring every single thing. One thing we didn't talk about tonight, but smartwatches that have a heart sensor that are counting your steps. Based on this, that wouldn't be okay, because it's going to happen every time your heart beats and you take a step, it's going to monitor it and activate the watch. The second thing is, you could say you don't want it to do that, but why are you wearing the smartwatch then if you don't want it to do that? Now you could say it's indirect. You're not pushing a button that says count my steps. It's doing it indirectly, and it's rabbinic. So there are some people who are pushing for leniency, but right here we would see that the world of tomorrow is not going to work today. But there's something very important if you read between the lines. He does say that it's not direct. You may not want it. It may not be indirect, or it may be indirect. It's rabbinic, and if there's a real need for it, you can do it. Well, other than life or death, if it's life or death, I can break anything on Shabbat. But here we're just talking about going to my hotel room. There's no ruling that says I can hunt an animal just because I'm hungry and want a snack. Because I'm outside, I'm a little cold. Again, not like so cold I'll die, but I'm in frostbite. But I'm a little cold, so it doesn't say I can start a bonfire. So the subtext here is that while the practice is not to do these things, fundamentally, there is a lot of room for leniency. And I'm not going to say fundamentally it's permitted, but it's not really that forbidden. It's become, and Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach from Israel, Zatzal, he pointed that out. The reason, ultimately, we don't use electricity is because that's become the accepted custom, A, and B, some rabbis who were brilliant thought it was totally forbidden, and to honor them and respect their opinion. But ultimately, why don't we use electricity? Because we don't. But in cases of need and exceptions, there's actually a lot of room for leniency. And if you look at examples of that, for electricity, timers, fine, I can't turn a light switch on or off, but what if I set a timer before Shabbat, and before Shabbat starts, and it'll turn the light on or off, which my house is full of. The shul now has a couple of them, so the slow cooker and the hot water urn can turn off. Reb Moshe Feinstein was very, very uncomfortable with them because he said, once you start using those automatic timers, what is Shabbat? You could set your TV to turn on at 2 o'clock so you could watch the sports game. So where did Shabbat go? Technically, it's permitted, but it's better to not do it. But ultimately, he allowed it. So what happens, though, when there's no way to get around it whatsoever? You can't have Shabbat. Shabbat just without censors. You can't live in this world without them. So that led to a number of rabbis from Israel. There's an organization called Tzomet that tries to deal with technology and Jewish law, Shabbat microphones, electric wheelchairs, and figure out ways to allow them because there's a great need for them. And it's electricity, which is rabbinic, and it's indirect, et cetera, like this, all these different things. And a great rabbi in Israel, Rabbi Nachum Eliezer Rabinovich, wrote an article, and then it was covered and summarized in this paper and this journal, et cetera, like that. So this is a really good English summary that talks about his ruling, and you can see the grounds for it having been built up in these previous sources. And Susan, I'll unmute you for that. You can see the groundwork for all this leniency being built up, but nobody had the courage yet to say, look, it's rabbinic, which is not nothing, but look, it's rabbinic and it's indirect and it's so many different things moving away, and there's a real need for it. And you can't stay in a hotel without these magnetic key cards. So let's go ahead and be lenient here. So go ahead, Susan, please, source number 3. And he mentions this journal in Israel, Tchumin, where the original article in its long form was written.
Published by the Tzomet Institute and Gush Etzion, published a shortened version of the Halach decision by Harav Nachum Eliezer Rabinowitz, past Rosh Yeshiva of Ma'ale Adumim. His opinion focused on authorizing the use of electronic sensors and smart cards in opening hotel doors on Shabbat. This article was a shortened version of the more extensive article that appeared in
Itecha Emunah.
Itecha Emunah, published by his Talmid Harav Eli Reif. No circuit closure.
Sorry, the way I formatted it differently. It's a new section. Why it's not an issue? It says no circuit closure. So sorry, I should have bolded that.
No circuit. There is no question that the closing of an electronic circuit, such as by switching on a bulb or sparking of a benzene motor, is forbidden according to the Torah on Shabbat because it transgresses one of the 39 forbidden malachot.
Pause there for just one moment, Susan, because we haven't talked about that. Is that everyone agrees, including your Rabbi Din, and that there are still electronic devices which would be problematic, and that would be an old-fashioned light bulb where it actually is like a burning filament. Now, I wouldn't turn on an LED light switch either, it doesn't really matter, but there is a distinction that most rabbis will make between LED lights, like the modern kinds of lights and LCDs and all that kind of stuff like that, and the old kind of bulb where there might be a spark. So for example, there is a big difference between an not old combustion engine car, they're still mostly combustion engines, where there's really mamash, absolute real fire when you start the engine, versus a Tesla, which no one permits, and I don't think this rabbi would permit it either, but there's no fire. So the difference is he's saying like these old benzene and sparks and stuff like that, that's forbidden by the Torah because there is a form of fire. A spark can start a fire. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about magnets and sensors and microchips and stuff. So please, where it's, and he does make a distinction between if you say that on the quantum level, there's a tiny thing that's light and photon like fire, he's like, it's so small, it doesn't matter. But he'll make that point. Go ahead, please, Susan.
It transgresses one of the 39 forbidden malachot. The question arises as to what is the law about an activity of closing an electronic circuit that does not result in a
Forbidden activity?
Forbidden, okay, I had the pictures of people.
Oh,
Forbidden
no.
activity, okay, at the bottom of the, forbidden activities such as a fan or computer or elevator or air conditioner. These activities too have been forbidden by the halachic scholars, although there is much argument as to much argument as to the reason for forbidding these activities. Harav Nachum Rabinowitz argues that electrical equipment that doesn't result in a forbidden activity should not be used on Shabbat to prevent the Shabbat resembling weekdays. According to Harav Rabinowitz, however, the foregoing arguments and dissents reflect the activities of past electric equipment which were based on closing of a circuit by means of a physical activity by the equipment. He claims that today many electronic devices do not result in the closure of a circuit or creation of a new flow of electricity, and the circuits are based on miniature automatic semiconductors in which the current is virtually undetectable.
Pause there just a moment. Sorry, I want to unpack some of what he said there because it's so important. So on one side, the extreme of what everyone agrees is forbidden is using a light switch, flicking on a light switch that closes a circuit that sends electricity to an incandescent bulb. Not only is that forbidden, but it's probably forbidden by the Torah, most would agree. But now, again, we start moving down the ladder. What if the light bulb is not incandescent, it's LED, so it doesn't use any kind of spark? So that's what he's talking about here when he says things like computer, elevator, air conditioner. There's nothing fundamentally, there's no category of a fan spinning. There's no category of typing on your computer. Now, yes, when you type, you activate sensors on your screen and pixels, et cetera, like that. But fundamentally, that's not in one of the categories of forbidden things. And the reason we don't do it is what we talked about earlier, because it's rabbinically forbidden. And he even says that rabbinically, there's really no good reason, like Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach had said, there's no good reason to forbid electronic devices. Why don't we do it? Because it resembles weekday activities and would destroy Shabbat. Just like Rav Moshe Feinstein Zatzal didn't like timers because they could affect the Shabbat experience, even though fundamentally it's okay. He says that fundamentally turning on a computer, it doesn't fit into any of the 39 categories. Should be permitted, but the rabbis have a safety net, which is anything that ruins the Shabbat spirit, takes away the Shabbat experience, we can forbid it on those grounds. But what about activating something? Again, there's no fire, no spark. It's these insignificantly small switches, and the thing that it activates will not ruin the Shabbat experience. That's a new paradigm. Again, if we use a world where fine, it's on a spaceship where everything is electronic, so I can push a button, food will come out, doors will open, music will come on. Technically, I haven't broken one of the 39 Torah categories, but Shabbat is bye-bye. But what if I'm using these sensors to open a door or to make it so it's not hot? Is that really going to ruin Shabbat? That is the shift in thinking that Rav Rabinowitz and his student Rav, I don't know if it's Rafe or Rife, but they and others who agree with him go on. So please, so now it's going to talk about hotels and specifically smart card technology. Please, Susan.
Okay, was it smart card technology?
After the ellipses.
Okay, smart card technology is on the rise, and many hotels, the elevator doors will open when the smart card approaches the permanent sensor on the elevator door. The door will open and the elevator will automatically go to the required floor without the need to press a button. Harav Rabinowitz claims that not only does smart card technology not break any of the 39 forbidden Shabbat activities, it does not open or close any electrical circuits, nor is there any current generation, only force. Let's see.
There was a whole section that got really technical that I think I got, but I didn't want to
Okay,
go too
only-
much into it. So
not
whatever it is,
current-
not a problem.
There's no current generation, only fourth generation.
Yeah.
In addition, he discounts the claim of.
Sorry, that got backwards. It's make bepatish, which literally is the final hammer blow, and it's one of the categories not permitted on Shabbat. It's not just building a building, it's finishing a building. So what looks like finishing something that you're building is closing a circuit. Remember I said that the rabbis had tried to come up with all these crazy reasons that activating an electrical device should be forbidden. They tried to put it into here, make bepatish, and bone and building and fire and everything like that. But again, the technology today doesn't fit into any of those things. Because if that was true, that electricity opening and closing a circuit was building or finishing a building, you couldn't open the door to your house. Because every time you open the door to your house, you open a gate, you've unfinished your building. And then closing it, you've finished your building. That's absurd, right? Why is that permitted? Because that's the way the door works. And that's the way that electric circuits work as well. They're meant to open and close. So that Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach and other great rabbis have said that's ridiculous. But he goes reason by reason and says, none of these apply. You have no reason, you have no basis in Jewish law for forbidding these kinds of smart cards. Please continue because there's no permanent.
Okay, in addition, he discounts the claim because there's no permanent transformation of metal to a permanent magnet, only a transient change to an existing magnetic force.
You haven't done it, you haven't created something new. It's just like a temporary click, click, if that.
The claim of
No lod, meaning creating
Lod?
something new. And again, all of these things make sense on Shabbat. I've created something new. I've cooked, raw food and made it into new food or made ice, etc., like that. Those all make sense in those categories. But here, you haven't done anything. It's a sensor that is meant to go like this, meant to go just like the door of a house, open and close, open and close. And it's so insignificant, you're never even going to see it. Please continue.
the claim of no lod is also not relevant, claims Harav Rabinowitz, because any changes are only transient, which does not qualify for the prohibition of no lod.
You haven't made
In
something new
support
and
of his
permanent.
opi-
Sorry, continue. Yeah.
In support of his opinion, Harav Rabinowitz brings the opinions of poskim that allow one to walk along streets where security cameras. Oh my gosh! Now I've lost. Okay.
Oh no, functioning. Do you want me to take over or you got it?
Well, okay, I lost my place. I think you must have scrolled up or something.
I don't think so.
Do
Do you see where he has
security
work in bold letter or in
cameras.
capital letters?
Oh, okay.
It's a few lines
Where
above that.
security cameras are functioning on the basis that here too, the signal is transient and does not generate a new circuit, but only causes a transient and minimal change in force in existing circuits. This led Harav Rabinowitz to his innovation. He states that two conditions are necessary for the term work to apply to an activity. One, it should be seen as an actual, observable, recognizable action carried out by a person. Two, it should have a determinable, definite result. If, however, there's no actual action and directly related result, then it is not forbidden. If a person walks near a door, walking is not one of the 39 malachot, and he has no intention of doing a forbidden activity, even if he wants to enter the door, even if there is no alternative way of entering. It is permitted to enter because when opening a door, there is no forbidden activity or appearance of activity. Furthermore, claims Harav Rabinowitz, there is an additional reason for permitting the use of sensors and smart cards, and that is the issue of Shabbat.
Flip it around. It's supposed to be Oneg Shabbat.
Oneg Shabbat.
Which is the Shabbat spirit, Shabbat joy. And this is so funny, just on that last phrase, the issue so far has been that allowing use of all these electronics will ruin the Shabbat spirit. But if you're staying at a hotel and you can't go into your room, you can't enter into your room and have a good night's sleep, it's going to ruin Shabbat. So by allowing and permitting us to use certain kinds of electronic devices, it actually can save the Shabbat spirit. But he makes some very clear distinctions here. And again, without getting all the technical about it's rabbinic or it's indirect and anything like that, his two things is, if your action, if I turn on a light switch, a physical switch has moved up. If I open, I couldn't see the electricity moving, but a physical thing has happened. And then a light, an observable light, has turned on, a definite thing there. But if I slide a card, which I can carry cards, I can carry books and everything like that, I slide a card, maybe I'll hear a click. And there's actually another article that talks about LED lights turning on, but he defends that and says it's really not a big issue. because of the way the light works. It's not really changing anything. It's already present there. But if I slide my card, I'm not really seeing what's happening. It's a magnetic field. You can't see magnet. It's actually with kashrut too. If I eat a food, I have to check, vegetables, I have to check for bugs. But what if there's a bug that I can only see if I use, the Hubble Space Telescope? That doesn't count. Things that are not observable by the human eye don't count. You don't have to worry about them. And that's true even when we have the technology today. You only need to worry about kashrut issues for bugs that are significant. So too, he says, you only need to worry about electricity, a change that is significant. And the other thing is, I don't see the sensor moving inside. So barely anything's happened. I don't see it happening inside. Well, then why can't I do that for anything? When I turn on my laptop, there's a tiny button that I barely have to push down on. It doesn't, I guess it makes the chime when my computer starts up, but again, it's electricity. I barely do anything. It's insignificant. I'm not even using a card. Why can't I turn on my computer? And the reason he said earlier is because if I'm sitting on my computer on Shabbos, then Shabbat is really gone. But if I'm opening a door, how is opening a door going to ruin Shabbos? Even if it's an automatic door. And he points out that rabbis, ultimately, if you're walking on the street, there's security cameras. Obviously, you don't want them to record you. But the fact that you're allowed to move, knowing that they are going to record you and activate a thing here, and similar rulings, knowing that that can be permitted, then why can't this be permitted? Because there's a real legit need for it. And it's doing way less. Way less is happening in the universe when you slide a card than when a security camera picks you up and records. Even to a sliding door or these elevators. In fact, in New York, when people walk into a lot of apartments and they're Jewish residents, the elevator operator or the front desk person will see them and say, enjoy floor 19. You don't even have to talk to them. They push the button for you. Why is it permitted? Because you're not doing anything. But how is an elevator going to ruin Shabbos? In fact, having to walk up 20 flights of stairs, that would ruin your Shabbos. So there are some Shabbos elevators that stop on every floor. That's lovely. But ultimately, he's saying this is not about destroying Shabbat. This is about protecting Shabbat in the future. And if you're going to come to me and say, oh, you're breaking all these Shabbos laws, he's going to cross his arms, lean back and say, oh, enlighten me as to what laws you think I'm breaking. And as he's pointed out, and so many great minds before him as well, really hard to argue you're breaking anything. But again, why don't we just permit it across the board? Because if you really do permit every electronic device, including a Tesla car, then Shabbat is really bye-bye. And we actually see that really beautifully in this last article. It's from the foreword, the English version of this forewords, and it actually quotes some of my rabbis from YCT, who the school is typically known for being more liberal, but they actually take the position from the experience of Shabbat. It's not about whether it's technically permitted, it's about the experience of Shabbat. Yeah, just because you can permit something, doesn't mean you always should. So I brought this short selection from the article. So the article starts, consider the key card, a piece of plastic no bigger than a business card, flimsy and seemingly innocent. By the way, this article is directly responding to Rav Rabinowitz's ruling permitting key cards in hotels on Shabbos. And yet it's also possibly the trigger to a cascade of changes that could transform the experience of the Sabbath by making a bevy of other devices, from iPads to stoves to cars, permissible on the traditionally low-tech day of rest, which, by the way, Rav Rabinowitz explicitly says none of those are okay. It's because this key card thing does barely anything and it's opening a door. It's not a big deal. That's a discussion that's been making the rounds in some Orthodox circles the past few weeks after a recent rabbinical ruling, I think this might be 2014, maybe I'm wrong, loosened the prohibition on the use of a magnetic key card, for example, a hotel on the Sabbath. And this is one of my rabbis, Rabbi Yissaschar Katz. It was a long battle. Shabbat fought back valiantly, but she ultimately lost the fight against technology. Rabbi Katz, he's such a sweet person. He has a lot of drama and theatricality to him. He has great articles or posts on Facebook as well. The head of Talmud studies at Yeshivat Chovei Torah, an Orthodox rabbinical seminary in the Bronx, wrote on his public Facebook page. Now, he's overstating the fact a little bit. Shabbat is not dead because of this. But if people are going to take that ruling, and that's the thing, Rav Moshe Feinstein came up with a ruling, because let's go back for a second with milk. For Jews to drink milk, it has to have been watched over or checked in with a Jew the whole time to make sure that it was always from a kosher animal. In America, it's not easy to get that very kosher milk called Chalav Yisrael, the milk of a Jew. So there was a school that said, we can't afford it. We can't get it. And he said, look, in America, if you put pig's milk instead of cow milk, you will be sued out of existence. So because of those safeguards, you, one school, I'm writing to you directly, you school, you may do it. This is an exceptional case because, you know, you really don't have to worry about it being not milk, cow's milk, and it'll be a financial burden. Well, guess what happened? Then it got accepted everywhere. Everybody said, oh, I don't have to drink Chalav Yisrael milk anymore. And it became accepted, not just for that, but for other reasons as well. So too, this ruling, he says, I'm just talking about key cards. We're just for hotel doors. But what happens once you open the floodgates? That's what Rabbi Katz is saying. So the latest ruling, given by an Orthodox rabbi, Rabbi Eli Reif, earlier in July, and endorsed by Rabbi Nachum Rabinovich, who helms the yeshiva in Israel, comes as orthodoxy grapples to preserve religious boundaries in a modern world. The use of magnetic key cards is likewise a deep concern to Sabbath observers. I'm always receiving questions about how to get into one's hotel room on Shabbat, and this is true. I don't know if I've asked him directly, but I've seen people ask him. And I think if Rabbi Rabinowitz has signed off on it, it would be accepted by many people, and that's important. Nobody wants to be the first rabbi to allow something that's never been allowed before. But once somebody's done it, then you can piggyback, and then you have not just one brave rabbi, you have 3 brave rabbis, 10 brave rabbis, and then you don't have to be brave anymore. It just becomes accepted by many people. It would be accepted by many people. The need for such a ruling is huge. Rabbi Linzer understands the experience of Shabbat in hotels and apartments, etc. The Dean at Yeshivat Chovevei Torah wrote in an email to the Ford. Both Rabbi Katz and Rabbi Linzer have qualms about the ruling. It would make Sabbath observance easier for some, the rabbi said, but at what cost? And that is the great point. Now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't support the ruling. And Rav Linzer was saying, this is a great ruling, and I think it'll help people, but let's be careful about making sure it stays to this and not to smartwatches and iPhones and computers and Nest systems. There's a serious concern of opening the floodgates, Rabbi Linzer wrote. Rabbi Katz worried about the day when Jews would read their Shabbos prayers off Kindles, iPads, or tablets. Again, he loves to be dramatic. A religious ruling of this kind, known as a psak, and it's similar to that word for psik resha, like cutting off the head of a chicken. A psak is, you just cut the ruling, end of story, is not religiously binding. And some rabbinical arguments against the use of magnetic keys have already emerged in the past few days, but this ruling could certainly be cited and observed by many. Just because you have, 10 rabbis, 2 permit and 8 forbid, you just go by those 2 rabbis. It's a very complicated process, but it's out in the wild now. You can't unsay what these rabbis said. Electricity seems ubiquitous in our lives, but the new psak was not striking the balance properly, Linzer wrote. I believe that we should never allow the use of an electrical device or triggering of a motion sensor across the board and in all circumstances, meaning that he would have liked the ruling to have a line, you can do this when there's no other option. That's not what the ruling said. The ruling said there's no problem with this. Go for it. Use a sensor. Walk through a door. Scholars over the years were not afraid to introduce accommodations that made Shabbos bearable for the elderly, the sick, the infirm, or anybody else who was unduly inconvenienced by the prohibitions, he wrote. They correctly surmised that Shabbat would survive a Shabbat elevator or even a Shabbat microphone. And I went to a synagogue once where they had one set up. I actually helped them set it up. And it's fascinating, the rulings and who permits it and how it can be done. But it's not there so you can have a concert. It's there so the congregants who are much older and are hard of hearing in the back can hear the rabbi speak and hear the tefillot. That's what Rabbi Linzer really wants to be emphasized about this ruling. This is not for somebody who could easily say somewhere else. This is, you don't really have an option. But the new psak, Rabbi Katz wrote, could potentially undermine the system completely. If digital action is not considered halachically prohibited activity, Katz went on, cooking would be mutar, permitted, since we light our stoves digitally. One would, for the same reason, also be allowed to drive a car on Shabbat. Now, by the way, the cooking one is not actually so simple because the rabbis do talk about, indirect ways of cooking, but hypothetically, like cooking for the sun or the heat of the sun, etc. But hypothetically, there might be a way to, cooking is a forbidden action. But is it just cooking or is it cooking through fire? Or is it cooking through heat? So these conversations will happen as traditional gas stoves are probably rightly being thrown out, don't throw them out the window, but they're being upgraded with induction and electric stoves. To be sure, others downplayed the importance of the psak altogether, saying that it applies to only the more liberal strains of orthodoxy. And I would call hooey on that. There's once a ruling is out in the wild, you're going to blame and say only the liberals are doing this. But in the real world, anybody who needs to do this is going to take advantage of it. Not everybody, but many people will. So this quote, the left of Orthodox goes for these things, said Rabbi Pinchas Woolstone, who has a background in the Chabad Lubavitch Hasidic sect. The center wavers, the right wing comes out against it. Now that's a media statement. In fact, the entire article pointed out that the left of orthodoxy is explicitly having a problem with it. But the reality behind all of this is that Shabbat needs to adapt to the world that we're living in. And as the world changes, the big concern is if we make any accommodations to Shabbat, it'll disappear. But the flip side, as Rabbi Rabinowitz said in his article, is if we ignore those changes and we don't allow Shabbat to adapt, and the world keeps changing, Shabbat will disappear anyways. People will say, look, I'm just going to break Shabbos. I can't go into my home. I can't go in a hotel. I can't do anything unless I can't walk down the street without activating sensors. So either I'm going to live in a cloistered community in the middle of nowhere, which Jews and other religions have groups that do that, like the Amish. You could do that. Not what most people are going to do. Most people are living in the real world. They're going out there. They're progressively more and more getting, being involved with sensors, et cetera, like that. And what we've seen is built into the very laws, there's already a leniency. So that's very, very nice. But the reason to not be lenient is to strike this balance between protecting the nature of Shabbat. And the truth is, I think Rabbi Rabinowitz actually did capture that very, very well, but the conversation is far from over. He really, even though one could say his ruling was expansive, really was pretty limited. He allowed you to unlock a door, which you can already do on Shabbos, and you're doing it in such an insignificant way. But again, the house of tomorrow's spaceships, hotels, everything like that are going to be so much more difficult to navigate. And the question is, are we going to rely on Rabbi Melamed, which is the mainstream ruling? Rabbi Melamed is not long. That is the mainstream ruling about you really have to, unless there's an emergency and there's no other choice, ask a non-Jew. Is that going to be, are we going to be able to maintain that? Are we going to be able to maintain that for the future? And the reality is I think we can all agree, no, we're not going to be able to maintain that unless we live, again, in a cloistered community in the middle of nowhere. So this is the power of something like a modern orthodoxy, is trying to deal with modern laws, but allow the orthodoxy part of it to work together rather than working against it. So at the end of the day, it's really a question of what Shabbat is going to be. And we can either allow Shabbat to be destroyed, or we can be a little bit flexible and protect Shabbat for many, many future generations.